Again, welcome back. I'm Bejar of by Tinby, and in this video, we're going to learn painting a simple composition of Plumerias. And apart from learning how to paint these floral illustrations, I also show you how to use gouache as backgrounds. Using gouache's background would allow us to enhance the visual impact of our floral illustration. And as a bonus, I also show you how to use gouache as acrylic or as watercolor. So let's get started. So this is the artwork that we will be doing for this lesson. It's basically a combination of some of the techniques that we have discussed in our previous lessons. So for the plumerias, we'll be applying the glazing technique, or what we call the wet on dry technique. For the leaves, we're gonna use the graded wash. For the buds, I'll be introducing a new technique which is called the variegated wash. And lastly, I'll show you how to use gouache. And as a bonus, I'll be showing you how we're going to use gouache as an acrylic and as watercolor. But before we start painting, I'll be showing you the materials that we're going to use for this class. For the paper, I'm using Strathmore watercolor pad in series 400 in 9 by 12 inches. For the paints, I'm using my Merry Blue watercolors, Cadmium Yellow Medium, Permanent Orange, and Sap Green. And for the gouache, I'm using Sap Green as well. Later on, I'll show you how I'll use Sap Green gouache as watercolor and acrylic. Then for the brushes, I'm still using round brushes in Princeton Aqua Elite in size 1, 2, and 4. Again, the idea here is to use one smaller brush for detailing and one larger brush for blending it with clean water. And for the palettes, I'll be using ceramic palettes. And of course, 2 cups of water, one for cleaning the brushes and another one for my clean source of water. And lastly, a tissue wherein I can dab my brushes for better water control. And for the sketch, I'll start with the light sketch of the artwork. You can actually access this reference as part of the instruction list of this class. So let's start with the flowers or the plumerias first. So we're going to paint the plumerias using the glazing technique. So plumerias are normally yellow at the center, slowly transitioning to white. And oftenly, plumerias has folds in their petals. So in order for us to create that detail, we're going to skip painting on a thin part on the left side of the petal to create its fold. Idea here is to add a fold for every petal so it shows like a dimension to our painting. I'll start by preparing a tea-like mixture of cadmium yellow that would serve as a base wash for our petals. It has to be watery so we can drag and blend it to create our petal structure. I'll apply it using the tip of my brush at the center of the petal, and using a different brush, I'll load it with clean water, dab it in a tissue to lessen its wetness, and drag it to create the shape of our petal. And as you can see, I'm leaving out white spaces to show plumeria's real color, which is more like a combination of yellow and white. The idea here is to just apply a soft wash of yellow, blending with the white of the paper. I'm going to do it petal by petal, so don't forget to leave out the spaces for the fold. So I'll just basically apply the base wash in all the petals of our plumerias. You can make the mixture softer by adding and blending the yellow with water. Since we're going to add more layers in the flowers, we're going to let the washes to dry out first. And while waiting for the first layer to dry out, I'll move on with painting base washes for the other plumeria flowers. And of course, you can use smaller brushes for the small flowers so it's easier to paint. Once everything's completely dried out, we can now add our next layer. I'll use the same method here, but this time I'll put it on the center and the lining of the fold with a thicker mixture and a combination of cadmium yellow medium and permanent orange. And I'll just soften it with clean water. As you can see, I'm leaving out portions from the base wash that we did earlier so it can still show the lighter yellow we have applied. This will somehow show depth and dimension to our painting. And as we apply the second layer, we can see that our petal structure looks more defined compared with just applying a light base wash. So this is how I actually build my colors. I normally work with multiple layers until I'm satisfied with its color. And particularly for this artwork, I'm just gonna use 2 layers as I don't want it to end up to be too dark, as I really like to show like a soft transparent effect on my florals. So I'll do it again petal by petal and move forward with the small plumerias of this artwork. And same with what we did earlier, we're going to let the second layer dry out first before we can add our last layer of details. So while waiting, I'll apply a graded wash technique in the leaves first. And same with our first lesson, I'm not gonna paint over the veins to show details and to show like the division of the leaf. And with the same approach, I'll add a cream mixture of Sap Green gouache near the petals, soften its edges by getting a different brush loaded with clean water, and slowly drag to create our midtones. And lastly, to add more water, soften the edges, and create our highlight. You can actually revisit our first lesson in order for you to have a practice of creating the graded wash technique. You should ensure that the edges look soft so we can create a seamless gradient on these leaves. And as you can see, by just adding water in gouache and thinning its consistency, the gouache paint can still look very transparent like watercolors. So for the leaves, work on one side at a time in creating the gradients. And personally, I start painting on the right side first as it's more convenient. So I'll use the same approach in painting the other leaves of this illustration. So now we move on with painting the buds of our Plumerias, and this time I'll introduce a new technique which is called the variegated wash. The variegated wash is when two colors are blended seamlessly using the wet and wet technique. You can actually use two methods here. So for the first method, you can start with the light color first by adding a wet mixture of yellow first, then add orange on the other side, then it overlaps with the yellow, allowing it to bleed with each other. You can make the blending seamless by softening it with clean water. Or for the second method, you can actually start by applying the dark color first and add your yellows. But basically in these two methods, I personally prefer starting with the dark color first so the colors would look bolder and less saturated. But of course, it would depend on which method is more convenient and comfortable for you. But honestly, any of these methods can actually work in this kind of illustration. So I'll apply the variegated wash in all the buds in our illustration. And in this technique, you have to ensure that your mixtures are wet so it can bleed with each other. Okay, so now let's move on with adding details to our plumeria flowers. By this time, I guess the layers we have applied in our flowers are completely dried out, so it's time to add our center details. The idea here is to add more texture to our flowers to show more dimension and depth. I'll use a milk mixture and create uneven lines in the center of each petal. I'll hold my brush vertically and very lightly so I can make the lines thinner so it looks more realistic. I'll basically apply these lines to all the plumeria flowers. So now we're basically done with our main subject, a simple composition of plumerias, buds, and leaves. So now in order for our subject to stand out more, we will now create our background in gouache. In comparison to how we used the Sap Green gouache earlier, this time we'll make it very thick, dark, and pigmented, but still wet enough that it can still spread to our paper, making the gouache paints behave as acrylic paints this time. I'm going to paint all the white spaces in our sketch with the thick mixture of Sap Green. And as you can see, even if we painted the leaves with Sap Green gouache earlier, it would still show a significant difference as gouache applied with water appears to be lighter and more transparent, while the gouache with lesser water appears to be thicker, darker, and opaque. I really like adding backgrounds in my illustrations because it makes my subject stand out more and look more defined even if there are only few details applied in it. And creating backgrounds with gouache allows me to create like the structure of my artwork without adding outlines to it, which makes my artwork look more realistic. A tip in using gouache is to always use the tip of the brush and hold it vertically in outlining the area that you will be painting to ensure that you won't be painting over your painted artwork elements. In painting backgrounds, it actually looks better if it's painted evenly. So in order for us to do that, we can wait for the first layer of gouache to dry out first, then reapply it to the lighter parts to make it even. So yeah, this is our final artwork. I hope you enjoyed learning how to paint this beautiful composition of plumerias. And feel free to practice the techniques I've shown earlier, as these techniques can be applied to any botanical artwork that you will be making. So thank you for painting with me and see you in my next lesson.